Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. In today's video, I'm going to show you exactly how you can learn to read Arabic books without any sort of harakat, and what is a very particular system that you can put into place in your Arabic studies so that you can eventually achieve this particular goal. Now, before I go into that particular process that you need to take and what tips you need to involve in your studies, I think it's very important for us to mention some points regarding the concept of what is harakat and what is the concept of reading books without harakat. What is this all about? So that for those of you that may not be aware can have a better understanding of what we're going to explain in this particular video. Let's go into the first point, which is discussing what do I mean by the term when I say harakat. Now, harakat are basically markings that indicate short vowels on Arabic letters, and they are commonly known as the following: the fatha, which has the a sound, the kasra, which has the e sound, the dhamma, which has the u sound, the sukun, the shadda, and the tanween, which is basically the fathatain, which is the an, the kasratain, which is the in, and the dhammatain, which is the un. These are considered to be the harakat within the Arabic language. And what you find is that these harakat are usually placed on Arabic texts for beginners, for people that are foreigners to the Arabic language and they want to learn. And in order for them to learn how words should be pronounced, you would find these harakat placed on these words so that they can be brought closer to knowing how to read these words properly. And that's one of the reasons why you actually find that in the Quran itself, that the mushaf that we have, the harakat are placed on every single letter in the Quran, because a lot of people are actually not familiar with how the Quran should be read and recited. And so in order to remove any confusion or to remove the ability for somebody to mispronounce how the Quran should be recited, we find that the mushaf, the Quran itself, contains every single harakah on there so that me and you can know how to recite the Quran properly. Now, where is the discussion about learning how to read Arabic text without the harakat? Well, you see, as I mentioned, reading these books and these texts with harakat only come for textbooks or literature, which is basically for beginners. But the overwhelming majority of Arabic literature that is out there, books that have been authored, articles, newspapers, whatever it may be, you will find that these harakat are not placed on them. And the reason for that is because Arabs themselves, they know how these words should be pronounced. They know exactly what harakah goes on the first letter, on the second letter, on the third letter. And because it's part of the general ability with the language, there is no need for them to place these harakat on there. And so a person like me and you who are beginners to the Arabic language, we would not be able to read these particular texts without these harakat. And so the question now comes, which is, hey, how can I bridge that gap and be able to learn how to read these Arabic books without this harakat in place? What is it that I need to learn? What is it that I need to do in order to basically go from point A to point B, from reading books like Al-Arabi to Bayni Yadayk, and Suwaru min Hayat Sahaba, which are books that contain harakat inside of them, to going to books which have no harakat, for example, Islamic books like the works of Ibn Taymiyyah and Al-Imam Ibn Qayyim and Ibn Kathir and Imam al-Dhahabi and Ibn Hajar. All of these books, they do not contain harakat inside of them. If they are harakat, there are very, very few, but the overwhelming majority of the text does not contain harakat. And for you to be able to know how to read them, what is it that you need to do? And that is exactly what I'm going to explain, inshallah ta'ala, in this video. Before I do that, I do want to point out something very important, which is many people do believe that learning how to read books in the Arabic language without any harakat is something which is far-fetched and it's not achievable for a foreigner to the language. And I would actually say that that's not the case. Rather, I would say that it's something which is completely in reach. It does require a bit of effort because there is a particular process that you have to take. There isn't any secret formula to this. Rather, it's a very simple step process that every person that wants to learn the Arabic language and wants to be able to read would have to take this process. But it's not out of reach. is not something that you can't achieve. And I'm going to show to you an example of how many of you that are watching this video are actually already able to read certain things within the Arabic language without any harakat whatsoever. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to place on the screen right now a verse and ayah from the Quran. And I'm going to have all the harakat removed from this particular ayah. Now, you can see this ayah on the screen right now, and I'm sure many of you are already able to read what this ayah is basically saying and how it should be pronounced. It's the first ayah in Surah Al-Fatiha, and you read it as Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Now, many of you were actually able to read that flawlessly without any single mistake, and there are no harakat that are present on there. And so the question you might ask yourself is, hey, so how can I do that? I've not even started studying the Arabic language, but I'm able to read this verse without any harakat whatsoever. Well, the reason for that is actually very simple. It goes down to two very important things, which is number one, you learned how these words in this particular ayah were pronounced and recited previously with harakat. As I mentioned, the Quran, the Mus'haf, the harakat are all present. And so for those of you that had read the Quran and you read Surah Al-Fatiha and you memorized it, because you read it with the markings, you have memorized it like that, and now you know. And so that when you see these letters, the alif and lam and the ha and the mim and the dal, you know that the ha is going to have a fatha and the mim is going to have a sukoon and the dal is going to have a dhamma, because you memorized it like that. Now the Quran actually has something which is a little bit more easier, inshallah ta'ala, which is the fact that the Quran, not only are the harakat very specific, but even the word order of every ayah is very specific, meaning the Quran is not going to change. If you memorize it as Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, then no matter where you see this, you would always know that it's pronounced like this in this particular order. Now the problem that you have with Arabic text is that words are used, but in many different forms, and they change. You might see in an Arabic text the letters ha, mim and dal, like the word alhamdu here, but it may not be pronounced like that. It might be pronounced differently. The last letter dal might not have a dhamma, it might be a fatha, it might be a kasra. We don't know. And for that reason, it requires a little bit of more of an extra strategy of learning that you need to apply. But the Quran is a little bit more simple. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran, right, that the Quran is easy to remember. And so because of the fact that it's always going to be like that, you memorize it once, then you would know that if you see these ayat without the harakat, you're able to read it. So now the question we need to answer is, how do I do this? How do I start to learn how to read Arabic text without any sort of harakat? So let's discuss that inshallah ta'ala. So now when we're looking at how can a person start to read Arabic text without any sort of harakat, we have to first understand how do the harakat work on a word. Now there are two sets of harakat that you have to focus on. Number one is every word has the main harakat of the word of how that word is pronounced. So for example, if we take the following word right now that you can see on the screen, the way it's pronounced is that the kaf has a kasra, okay? The ta has a fatha, and you would say kitab, kitab. That is the bulk of the word and how it's pronounced. And so you have to learn the pronunciation of the bulk of the word first. So for example, the word kitab, or for example, the word shajarah, okay? Shajarah, which has fatha on the sheen, the jim, and the ra. But now there is another set of harakat that you have to understand as well, and you have to know, which is the ending of every single word. Now, why is this different to the first one? The first one is knowing how the word should be pronounced generally, and that doesn't really change. Once you learn that the kaf and then the ta and then the alif and the ba should be pronounced as kitab, every time you see it like that, you would always know, hey, this word is pronounced as kitab. But what's the pronunciation of the last letter, the ba? what harakat do I give there? Do I give it a fatha? Do I give it a dhamma? Is it a kasra? Is it a sukoon? Is it a shadda? Is it a tanween? That is something which you learn when you study Arabic grammar, when you study the science of an-nahu, okay? And specifically when you study i'rab, because the science of Arabic grammar will teach you what is the harakah on the last letter of a word. And so when you study those principles and you learn when it is a dhamma or when it's a fatha or when it's a kasra or whether it's a sukoon or whatever it may be, when you learn that science, you would know that when the word kitab comes in a particular sentence in a book that you're reading, whether it's going to have a dhamma on it, or whether it's going to have a fatha on it, or whether it's going to have a kasra on it, or whether it's going to have some sort of tanween. But you have to combine between these two knowledge. You have to combine between knowing how the word itself is pronounced and then knowing the science of Arabic grammar and nahu, specifically i'rab, in order to determine what is the last harakah of this particular word. And if you're able to do that, then if you memorize a bunch of vocabulary and you've also studied the science of Arabic grammar, when you're reading text, you would be able to determine that this word is pronounced like this. And now, because of the science of Arabic grammar, I know that the last letter here is going to have a dhamma. And then when I see the next word, I know exactly how that's pronounced because I memorized that word. But I also know that the last letter is going to have perhaps a fatha and so on. And so you have to give these two types of harakat consideration, and you have to learn them very well in order to be able to pick up whilst you're reading. Now, with that being said, there are certain words in the Arabic language that they come in the same form, and what I mean by that in the letter structure. So for example, the following word you can see on the screen, it has a kaf, it has a ta, and it has a ba. But what you find is that this particular word can come in different forms of its harakat. What I mean by that is you can use these three letters and form the following word, ka-ta-ba, which has fatha, fatha, fatha. But you can also form another word, which is kutubun, which is dhamma, dhamma, and then a tanween, okay, dhamma. You can also do the following word, which is kutiba, kutiba, which is a dhamma on the kaf, and then the ta has a kasra, and then the ba has a fatha. And so because there are certain words out there that have different ways that you can pronounce them, and each of those different pronunciations bring about a different meaning for us, because the word kataba doesn't mean the same as kutiba, and the word kutiba doesn't mean the same as kutubun. They all have distinct meanings. And so a way in which you'll be able to figure out and be able to overcome this problem, so that when you see these three letters, for example, in a sentence, and you're trying to figure out, okay, is it meant to be kataba, or is it meant to be kutiba, or is it meant to be kutubun? What would determine for you which one is the right one to place here is going to be the context. It's going to be the context. Based upon the sentence and the meaning that's being derived, you would know, in this particular sentence, the word kutub makes sense and not the word kataba, or that the word kutiba makes sense and not the word kutub. And so it does require for you to understand the context of what you're reading as well. And so the more you enhance in your vocabulary altogether in reading things and learning more vocabulary and memorizing words, you would be able to make sense of these words as you're reading. And so these are two very important things. Number one, and giving consideration to the bulk of the harakah of the word and how it's supposed to be pronounced, which is by memorizing the word as it is. Okay, the word qalam, you know that the qaf has a fatha and the lam has a fatha, and then there's the meme, and that word means pen. But then also learning the science of Arabic grammar and nahu, and specifically i'rab, in order to determine whether the last letter of this word is going to be qalamun or qalaman or qalamin, so that you're able to pronounce every single word and every single harakah correctly as you're reading these Arabic texts. So that's number one. Number two is that there are certain words that look exactly the same, but they are pronounced differently and they also have completely different meanings. And the way that you would be able to determine whether one word is used over the other is based upon the context. To give you an example, also in the English language, if you take the word orange, okay, the word orange has two meanings. Either it means a color or it could mean a fruit. And so when you see the word orange in a sentence, based upon the context, you would know whether this is referring to the color orange or whether it's referring to the fruit orange. And so you have to take these things into consideration when wanting to learn how to better read books without any sort of harakat. So if you've understood that and you've understood these principles that you have to keep in mind as you're learning, what is a step-by-step process that a person can take in order to just get better at reading Arabic text without any sort of harakat whatsoever? Here it goes. Number one, you have to learn vocabulary. You have to learn words and how they are pronounced. Now, how can a person do this? Number one, whether you're learning how to speak Arabic or whether you're learning how to read Arabic at the beginning with harakat, the point is you will come across words. And so what you do is you make a vocabulary list for yourself. So for example, if you're learning a book like Al-Arabiyyatu Bayna Yadayk and there are a bunch of words that you're learning, those words that you're learning how to pronounce, you make a kind of dictionary for yourself. You make your own vocabulary list and you write these words down and you write down the harakat on them and you memorize those words. And the more words you memorize, the more you'll be able to read, generally speaking, when it comes to books. Now, of course, the level of Arabic in books does differ. There are some books that are very easy with simple vocabulary, and then there are some words there are some books that have words that are for an intermediate level, and there are some books that are very, very advanced that even me, I would struggle with because of the vocabulary that is being used inside of it. And so you want to start at a very basic level by memorizing vocabulary, memorizing words, whether it's through speaking or whether it's through reading. And once you memorize those words, you're now building a mental dictionary for yourself so that when you do read things, you're going to be able to recognize these words and know how they are pronounced. Okay, so that's number one. You have to memorize vocabulary. The second thing that you have to do in order to get better at reading books in the Arabic language without any sort of harakat is you have to read books. But it's important that you don't try to read anything which does not have harakat inside of them. You don't try to read books from the get-go that have no harakat for two very important reasons. Number one, if you read it and there are no harakat and you don't know any Arabic in the beginning, then you're going to scratch your head in order to understand things and you're not going to understand it, and it might demotivate you and put you off from even wanting to learn because of how difficult you're finding it. Number two, because you're not familiar from the beginning of how these words are pronounced and you try to look them up in the dictionary and you don't know how to use dictionaries properly, you might end up getting the wrong definition for a word or the wrong meaning for a word, and therefore it will distort your understanding and even your memorization. And so it's better that from the get-go you try to read things that have harakat in them. And when you read books that have harakat inside of them, you try to read things that have a very simple vocabulary, and then you build yourself up. And as you progress in your reading of words which have harakat on them, you memorize those words, you learn them very well, and then what you do is that you progress to the next level so that your vocabulary is actually advancing as you're reading along. Now, a very important step that I think you should try to put together as you're doing this, which requires a little bit of work, but I promise you it's gold. It's gold, and it's the thing that can really make the difference between you getting much better at being able to read Arabic without harakat than most people, which is find a text which has harakat that you can read and you can learn and you can study. There are many books out there that are made for beginners. For example, you have Qasas al-Nabiyyin and many other books like that. And what I would say is do the following: is you take a chapter and you read the chapter with the harakat, and then you make a vocabulary list for yourself of the words which are inside of it, and you define those words and you memorize those words, and you read it again and again and again and again, multiple times, until you get the fluency of reading your tongue in pronouncing the words and understanding the context of what is being written here as well, and what you're reading. Then, and this is the extra step, which I promise you is going to be gold, is you take those chapters that you're reading, so for example, chapter number 1, and what you do is you now write out that chapter yourself. Okay, you write out the chapter yourself. But this time what you do is you write it out without putting any of the harakat on there. And then what you do is you try to test yourself by reading those texts again, which you just wrote out, by placing the harakat on there yourself. And so what I would do is try to attempt doing it without writing anything first, by just speaking out loud and reading what you're saying. And as you feel like you're getting the confidence of it, then you start to write down the harakat yourself, and then you cross-check between the actual text and what you've written to see that if you did it correctly or not. And if you made any mistakes, you highlight those mistakes, and then you perhaps come and you go ahead and you do it one more time in order to ensure to see that, wow, you can actually read and you can place these harakat, right, on these particular texts. And I think it's very important to do this with a text that you're reading. So you read something, then you rewrite everything by removing the harakat, and then you test yourself. And by the end of it, you will find that your ability to put harakat on words is going to come much more faster than most people that will take a much more longer process to do this. As you're progressing in your reading journey, it's also very important that you do pick up diverse texts. So you don't just read texts that are written on one particular topic in harakat, but you read also other texts that are written on other topics with harakat as well, and try to reproduce the step. And to give you an example, if you were to read, for example, a book on Aqidah, okay, on the Aqidah of the Muslims, the words and the vocabulary that is used there are very specific to the topic of Aqidah. And then if you were to read a book on the topic of fiqh, okay, or seerah, on the biography of the Prophet ﷺ, the vocabulary is going to be very specific and distinct for those topics. And so if all you ever do is just read books on Aqidah, then when you try to pick up reading a book on fiqh, right, without harakat, you're not really going to be able to understand a lot, because the vocabulary that's used in the Aqidah books are not the same that are used within the fiqh books or the seerah books. And so it's very important that you do take a diverse topics of books with harakat and try to produce the same step with them, so that you're overlapping with the vocabulary. So you're not just learning one group or one type of vocab, but you're also learning other topics and vocabulary and words that are used for those topics as well, in order to really enhance your mental dictionary and the words that you have memorized. The last thing that you need to involve in this process is by learning Arabic grammar. Okay, you have to learn Arabic grammar. As I mentioned to you, the harakat at the end of words, in order to know how to pronounce them properly, you must learn the science of al-Nahu. So you pick up a class, you pick up an easy lesson, whether you want to study Bayni Yadayk, whether you want to study the Medina books, whether you want to study, technical books like Al-Ajurumiyya or Mutammimatul Ajurumiyya, whatever it may be, but you pick up some sort of study or class on Arabic grammar and you apply your knowledge as you're reading. You apply it. So when you're reading books with harakat and you see that a letter ends with a dhamma, you go through the knowledge of the Arabic grammar that you know and say, okay, I know this is dhamma because of this principle that we learned, and then probably guess what the harakat might be for the next one, even though it's there, but just try to figure it out, and that will show to you that you're able to implement your ability of Arabic grammar on these words, so that when you do read things that don't have harakat, it will be a breeze. You'll be able to do it for that as well. And of course, you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help you and to aid you, because this is a knowledge that you learn that will aid you to understanding the Quran and the Sunnah. And of course, if your intention is pure and sincere, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will open the doors for you and help you. And so this is basically the steps that you need to take. You memorize vocabulary, you learn words, whether it's through speaking classes or reading classes, but you learn vocabulary. You read as often as you can, and you read books that have harakat, and you continue that process. And what you do is, whatever you read, you try to reread it by either rewriting it out without the harakat. There are obviously some websites out there where you can find certain texts which have harakat, and then you can remove the harakat from them and then try to read it. But I always believe that if you can put in the extra effort by writing out things, your ability to memorize and learn only enhances. Okay, it only enhances, it only gets better. And so that practice will also help you with the ability of writing as well. And so you do that, and you read a diverse topics of books with different harakat, and you also learn the science of Arabic grammar, and you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help you and aid you. And I believe anybody that takes this process is going to eventually be able to read books without harakat. This is a process that I took as well. I did do things a little bit differently, and as I learned, I realized that this is probably the better path to take altogether in order to understand and read books. And now, alhamdulillah, I have the ability to, all these books you can see around you, around me, in this video. I'm able to read them. They don't have harakat on them, but it's only through this process that I was able to do so. Inshallah ta'ala, just before I leave, as I mentioned, always, I have an institute, the Arabic Code Academy, where we basically teach you guys the Arabic language. So if you want to be able to speak, read, write, listen, understand the Quran better, be able to understand what you recite in the Salah, all of these things put together, we have a program which is the Arabic Essentials, which includes 10 important programs that will help you to really start your journey with the Arabic language. You can register by clicking on the link below. If you benefited from this video, give it a thumbs up and drop a comment of any benefits or anything else that you might want me to talk about and explain in further videos. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. May Allah bless you all. Barakallahu feekum wa jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.